Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is James Williams, and I'm program chair of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, one of the organizations sponsoring this event. I want to welcome you to this commemoration of the ratification of the 13th Amendment, or as some of us call it, Abolition Day. You know, it was about a year or so ago, if not more, that I was thinking, and I was aware that this date was going to be coming this year, and I wanted this community to do something to commemorate the occasion of such a momentous occurrence in the history of this nation. And so we began to work, put together a committee, and here we are today. I do want to take a moment to thank some of the organizations that have partnered with us to make this possible, and that includes Carolina Public Humanities of UNC. It includes the Paul Green Foundation, the Orange County Office of Civil Rights and Civic Life, the Chapel Hill Community History of the Chapel Hill Public Library, the town of Carrboro. We wouldn't be in this space without their assistance. And of course, our organization, the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. And I could say more about that, but in the interest of time, there's materials out on the tables as you come in that has information about OCCRC and our work, and I encourage you to take any of that you like. In addition, we do partner with the Equal Justice Initiative in doing this work, and there's materials, including their new 2026 calendar, that's out there on the table. Feel free to help yourself to those materials. This symposium, I believe, is the fourth, I believe, of a series of events that our organization and our committee has planned related to Abolition Day. There was one last night, played by Mike Wiley. There's this, and then later this afternoon, one of our keynote presenters will be at Flyleaf Books, Professor Jones, and then there's another event on December 10th. But I say all that to simply say that in my mind, this symposium is the crown jewel. It gives us an opportunity to explore. I mean, you can't explore all the ramifications of the 13th Amendment in 3 or 4 hours, but at least gives us an opportunity to explore some of the key themes and concepts. The program you have before you, we're going to have 2 panel discussions to follow our keynote discussion, and we will proceed with that discussion at this time. And it is my pleasure to introduce for this opening discussion Associate Justice Anita Earls and Professor Martha S. Jones. Professor Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor. She's a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. She is a writer, historian, legal scholar, and public intellectual whose work is devoted to the understanding of the politics, culture, and poetics of Black America. In addition to her teaching duties, she is currently touring the country basically in regards to her new award-winning book, recent book, The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. And then our own Justice Anita Earls, who I'm sure all of you know, is an Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. She previously served as the Executive Director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and before that, she was with the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. You know, one of the complicating factors of this morning is that it's happening at the time of the holiday parade here in Chapel Hill, Chapel Hill Carborough, but that's okay. So what we'll do, Professor Jones will stand before you at the podium and make some remarks for 10 minutes or so, and then she will be in discussion and conversation with Justice Earls. So thank you.
Well, good morning. I thought the band was for us. I didn't realize. So that's delightful. And thank you, of course, to James Williams and everybody who has made it possible for me to join you today. A special thanks to Justice Earls for the conversation, for the care. I'm very honored for the chance to talk with you. And I just wanted to say a few remarks to set up our conversation. Our theme today, the 13th Amendment, abolition, the Constitution. There are many ways to tell this story. And some of you will know that I am a historian of law and politics, and I have indeed written that story again and again through those lenses. Today, I want to invite you to join us in a conversation in a somewhat different register, and that register is family. Because for all the ways in which men and a few women in Washington and in Raleigh and in many other places were positioned to leave us a record of their workings around the project of slavery's demise, of abolition, of freedom, less evident, less archivally present, in some ways much more difficult to recover and to tell are the stories of our own families and their experiences of those remarkable, tumultuous years. So the trouble of color, which we're going to talk about this morning, is my turn to family history. And it's no accident that I'm here in North Carolina to tell that story, because much of it turns on two threads in my own family. One of which begins in eastern North Carolina in Chowan County on a plantation that ran along the river, and the other that begins here in a place that in my family we refer to as Little Texas, where folks said to be black, said to be white, said to be native, said to be many things, made families and grappled with the dynamics that were, on the one hand, the possibilities of abolition and freedom, and on the other hand was the endurance of the color line. So I think for me, a way to frame the conversation is to say that I hope I'm not giving too much away when I say I was born in the 1950s. Just own it, right? At our age, just own it. I'm a child of the 1950s, and I'm a child of marriage between a black man from Greensboro in North Carolina, and a so-called white woman from Buffalo, New York, the child of Irish and German immigrants to the United States. They were married in 1957. I was born the next year. And you know that in my father's home state of North Carolina and in 17 or 18 other states in the country, their marriage was not only barred, in many places it was a crime. And I grew up for a very long time believing that my family was aberrant, that it was not only outside the bounds of law, it was outside the bounds of culture, of politics, that we were out of step, there was no place for us. And indeed, our early years as a family were filled with a kind of strife as we looked to find a home and make a way as folks who evidently had crossed some color line that had for so long defined the nation. And I might have always believed that it was my parents there in the 1950s who had been responsible for this transgression. But in this book and the research for it, I discovered that, in fact, their choices were actually something like a family tradition. And that in 1827, 150, no, do the math, Martha, that's 130 years earlier. In 1827, my grandfather's grandfather, Elijah, and his wife, Mary, also had married across the color line here in Orange County. Now, to do so, they had to trick the eye of the clerk. Right? They had to convince the clerk that not only Elijah, who was by all accounts a man of color, was indeed a man of color, but they also had to persuade the clerk that Mary was a woman of color. Because since 1715, the state of North Carolina, or then before North Carolina was ever a state, anti-miscegenation laws had been the order of the day. And so here is a story about folks long before our civil rights moment, long before the moment of abolition and emancipation, are already wrestling with that problem of the color line, looking how to choose one another, how to make a family, how to protect that family. And if my family had endured snubs and slights, had endured redlining and other discriminatory real estate practices, had endured harassment and bomb threats, Elijah and Mary faced their own remarkable life-threatening challenges. If they were discovered, their marriage would have been invalidated. They would have been charged with fornication, a word we don't use very often today, but was a crime in 1827, one that punished people who engaged in intimate relations outside of marriage. They would have been charged with bastardy, their children born outside of wedlock, including my great-great-grandfather, Sidney Dallas, their youngest. They would have been subject to these kinds of recriminations for their family. And so they helped me to appreciate that when we tell family stories, there's a great deal about the past that is foreign, that is another place, but that we come from extraordinary traditions, some of them widely celebrated and others of them complicated to fold into the story of the American family. So with that, I think I'm going to join Justice Earls, but I just want to again say thank you to everybody here for having me, and I very much look forward to this conversation and to hearing from you all today. So thanks very much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here. And I especially want to thank James Williams for giving me the incredible honor of having this conversation. Professor Jones, I want to thank you for your work and for the beautiful way you memorialized it in this incredible book. And to hear you tell the story of your family when my family came along just a few years later, and I feel like you're saying the things I've said all along about what it meant to be a mixed-race family in that era. So thank you. I want to start by bringing us first to the topic of the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery, because I think that in your research, you did something that's really extraordinary and so important, and something I wish I could do more of. But you, and I learned this phrase just earlier, but this notion of going from naming to knowing. Like, we can name our ancestors, but you learned about their lives so that we could really know them. And so in a similar way, I think we can name that we understand that the ratification of the 13th Amendment did not immediately mean freedom, right? But I think you can help us know what that means. And so from the work that you've done, can you make real for us what it meant that, yes, now there was this abolition of slavery, but what did it mean for the lives of the people living at that time?
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it, that you and I share an interest and a commitment to law as a way of understanding the present, but also the past. But when I am teaching something like the 13th Amendment, I have to remind students, right, that it is a text, but it's no more than a text until people breathe life into it, until humans give it meaning in a lived way. So if I could start with a story, it would be one about my great-great-grandmother, Isabella. Isabella, by 1863, 1864, 1865, is enslaved in Chowan County in a plantation called Bandon. And she has borne 9 children by the man who claims her as property. And she leaves record of her story in 1867 in a complaint to the Freedmen's Bureau. You all know that the Freedmen's Bureau sort of picks up charge of formerly enslaved people and other refugees after the war in the place of the army. And she's living in Greensboro by then, and she goes in to file a complaint against this man. Now that's the first thing to say, right, is here she is, just, a stitch of time from having been enslaved, her 4 surviving children in her charge, and she is going to go first to the county clerk in the courthouse and then to the Freedmen's Bureau with a complaint against this man. What is the complaint? I think that's the interesting part about how this abolition is lived. Much is going to change at Bandon with slavery's abolition, including Isabella's freedom, but freedom to do what? To go where? To be who? With these children in her charge. Well, she makes a bargain with this man. And apparently they agree that she will migrate west to Greensboro and settle there. He promises to support her and her children, their children, if you will, and to purchase a home so that she has a start. And she takes that chance. I can't say how she gets from Chowan County all the way to Greensboro, but we can imagine there were carts and wagons and perhaps a train involved. But by 1867, it's clear that he's not going to keep the promise, right? There's the wrinkle, right? She's at the Freedmen's Bureau because he has made her a bargain and he has not kept it. Now, here, I'm trying to envision Isabella and the gumption, the courage. What are the words you would use that it takes to go into the county clerk, who, by the way, himself is a former Confederate soldier, son of a planter, and to tell that story and to believe yourself entitled to some restitution for the bargain that was broken. The Freedmen's Bureau sort of does its job in a very official way, but there's no satisfaction for Isabella. And she's left, right, to find community, which she does in an enclave called Warnersville in Greensboro, where she will meet, her daughter will meet the son of Mary and Elijah, who I mentioned earlier, and the Joneses will come all the way to me and beyond. But the point really is that someone like Isabella is not, freedom, I think, doesn't begin to capture what it takes to be a free woman and to have even the ordinary ambitions, the ambitions to be a mother, to have a home, to have a family, to raise your children. It requires you to be an advocate, to appear before official men and make your case in order to make a way. And to me, my admiration for her could only grow, right, as I understood the very quotidian things she needed to do in order to be free.
Well, and when you write about that in the book, I want to just explore for a moment a bit further this notion of the impact between the law and what's written in the books and people's lived experiences and how it's carried out. And so when you write about that in the book, you quote from Thomas Ruffin's decision in State versus Mann, where before the 13th Amendment was ratified, he says that the power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. And when I read that, I was like, but that was before the 13th Amendment. So, but it seems like what you're suggesting is that that notion continued on in how the laws were implemented.
Yeah, and I have a California cousin who discovered this 2-page document that Isabella had dictated her complaint, and then it is retranscribed into the ledgers of the Freedmen's Bureau with one embellishment, and in the margins someone writes, I think in red, bastardy, right? So Isabella has come, I think, to make a contract claim, right? She says, we had a bargain. Right, we had an understanding, we had a deal, and I'm here to get satisfaction, right, and to hold this man to the bargain. What the Freedmen's Bureau sees is a woman who's born children out of marriage and has offended the state, right? And so part of what became important for me was to recognize the way in which there's more than one story being told, even in the same scene, right? And a Freedmen's Bureau official tells it this way, right? Children born out of wedlock, destined to become a burden on the state. And Isabella says, no, right? I was a person with agency who entered into a contract, into an understanding with someone, and they should be held to that. Two very different stories about the very same moment, about the very same legal conundrum.
Well, and I think what you also illustrate is something that I think we forget. We now think about those civil rights moments in the law where Brown versus Board of Education and other major cases advanced the law, and yet from earliest times, people were trying to use the legal system to assert their rights. And so I'm just curious if there are other ways through your research that you found that right after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, people in your family, people were trying to exercise their freedom.
Yes. Well, again, marriage is another part of that story, right, for other folks. Part of my family comes from central Kentucky, a small city, Danville, and there, a couple, Nancy and her husband Edmund, have been together as enslaved people since 1845. They have children. They have made a life together under remarkably difficult circumstances. But with emancipation, they now have the possibility of coming into the courthouse and to formalizing that marriage, right? To no longer be vulnerable to charges of fornication or bastardy. And in the everyday courthouse records, today they're in the state archives, but for a long time they were just on a shelf in the clerk's office there in the county, is their marriage certificate, which tells that story. We have been together since 1845, 22 years. And here it's 1867, and we've come to formalize that union, right, to make it unequivocally a legal marriage. And these are the ways in which folks are not only making freedom and making families in abstract or cultural or intimate or interpersonal terms, right, but they understand the power of law, right, the import of law, the possibility at least that law will respect and regard those kinds of institutions, and marriage is one of them. And so we see it's not only Nancy and Edmund who are marrying, but there are stacks and stacks, right, of marriage certificates, folks coming in. We have been together 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, and now we want to formalize our marriage before the state. It becomes very important for someone like Nancy because at the end of her life, she's going to claim Edmund's Civil War pension. Edmund had served in the U.S. colored troops nearby in Fort Nelson, and she, that marriage certificate, right, is that evidence, right, that permits her to look to the state now to support her in her old age, and she does live to almost 1890, and so we can't underestimate, I think, the ways in which these seemingly small acts that happen right in the local courthouse, stay in the local courthouse, turn out to be so consequential, right, for who individuals, but who families become, communities become in freedom.
Well, I think it is so powerful that you are bringing to light this history of family and the ways in which people sought to then formalize familiar ties, because I think we often think of the legacy of slavery as one of how families were destroyed, children taken from their parents, couples separated, and so I want to, in the same vein of looking at resources and positives as opposed to deficits, what can you tell us about what resources formerly enslaved people possessed at the time that the 13th Amendment was ratified?
I'll come to back to North Carolina and to Greensboro. Warnersville was a tract of land. The cash came from a northern Quaker philanthropist. The work was done by formerly enslaved people who divided it into small plots, who built small homes, and Warnersville becomes this hub for formerly enslaved people, a hub that they have built, with their very hands, right, with their very material effort. One of the things that happens very early on in Warnersville, I think won't surprise most folks, is that a church is set up, a church and a school. And Isabella and her family are very much a part of that. Her daughter is married in 1868 in this makeshift church in Warnersville that local folks have stood up. So how do people make a way, right? It is about institution building, right? So community, church, school, that become the sustaining institutions. In Isabella's story, that church basement school, St. Matthew's was the name of the congregation, will become the seed for what is today North Carolina's Bennett College. Right, so here, formerly enslaved people working with some very consequential radical Republicans, including, I don't want to say he's not Greensboro's most notorious writer, but Albion Tourget, one of Greensboro's better remembered writers of this period. And if you haven't lately read Tourget's work, while it is fictionalized, my experience in reading it and rereading it alongside the archives was really how remarkably vivid his renditions of those real scenes were in works like A Fool's Errand. So this institution building is an extraordinary part of it, and we live still right, with the legacy. St. Matthew's still an active Methodist congregation until today in Greensboro. Bennett still thriving after all these years. So these are the ways in which freedom becomes institutionalized. You know, we talk a lot about the history of Reconstruction, the possibilities, the promise of Reconstruction. Sometimes folks will invoke the failure or the destruction of Reconstruction, but some of what endures, right, are indeed the schools and the churches that freed people have stood up, have invested in, and for folks like Isabella and her children, those are essential institutions. They have been abandoned by the man who made them promises back in eastern North Carolina. There's no question about that. And the way forward is now to become a part of and to help to build this new community. And it's one that sustains Isabella until her death in the 20th century.
Wow. In a moment, with your permission, I'm going to open it up for your questions, so be thinking about what you might want to ask. But before we do that, I want to turn a little bit to the question of sort of the craft or the process of you learning this history, because I found it fascinating when you talk in your book about how you would tell us the story of how you would ask archivists, for example, to look through papers, and they would come back to you and say that, no, there's nothing there, and yet when you went, you found something. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, by the time I work on this book, it's important to say I've been a family historian long before I was a historian. I used to be a lawyer. I think that Justice Earls knows that. And my idea of a summer vacation was going to the archives and looking for family history. I once dragged my sister to New Orleans, you know, and she had in mind, you can imagine what she had in mind, and I kept saying, well, but the Amistad Research Center is really wonderful, and there's so much there, and she was very kind. She would come for a few hours in the morning, and then she'd say, I'll see you for dinner, and so we split it that way. But it was true that I had always been the pack rat, the person, if you had, you know, a cache of family letters or papers or things you didn't know what to do with, I'm the one. My husband was responsible for packing them and moving them every time we migrated, which we have done quite a bit of. But I had a lot of history under my belt and historical writing under my belt by the time I sat down to actually write this book. And what happens is that very quickly I learned that I am not going to, it's not possible for me to continue to be the scientist, you know, the researcher, the professor, you know, the objective person. I think that was my fantasy going in. I would use my expertise and I would tell you all the definitive story. But again and again, as you say, in these chance encounters, folks draw me into the story and in their own way show me that while I'm telling a story about the past, I'm also telling a story about the present. One example, in Danville in Kentucky, I'd never been to, now I've spent my whole life here in North Carolina, you know, as a visiting family, and it's a place I like to think I know pretty well, but I'd never been to Kentucky. And I'm a New Yorker, if you can't tell. And so I'm a fish out of water, right, in Danville, in the local public library. You know, nobody's mistaking me for a local person. But when I explain, and then explain again to the librarian that I'm looking for Nancy, who is enslaved by a family named Bell, and I'm emphatic with her in a polite way, she gets very quiet and kind of draws close and starts to whisper. Now, you know you're already having a kind of strange experience when a librarian begins to whisper. But then she says to me, now be careful, right? Be careful. And I think she's saying two things. On the one thing, I'm treading very close to the histories and the reputations of some very fabled families in the early history of Danville, and I am suggesting somehow that my family, enslaved people and their descendants are connected intimately to the Bells, which we are. But I think she's also worried about me. You know, that she's worried that I might speak to the wrong person, find myself in the wrong room, and I need to be careful because she's not sure how folks are going to read me or respond to me. And I am frightened. I mean, you know, I say that in the book. I mean, I leave and I'm shaken. And it's in those kinds of moments when you realize you're no longer telling an objective, you know, true capital T story, that you are part of, we are all part of our family stories. And we live them in a 21st century way, but they are bound up, right, with the stories that have been told and told again and told differently and told the other way, and some of them not told at all, like Nancy's story and her connection to the Bells. So librarians and archivists, curators, essential to this work. I'm deeply, deeply indebted to the folks who have kept all those tiny shards of paper that you stitch together to try and tell a family story. But among them are folks, you know, who are in their own way, right, still trying to make sense of our history, our American history. And they help me to find another way to tell the story.
Well, so following up on that theme that you're telling a story not only about the history, but about the present, I just have to ask you this question that I wrestle with all the time. And this is really in part from a legal perspective, but I see how maybe if you take the history of the civil rights struggle from a legal perspective, we have these moments where we get advances, where the law opens up doors of opportunity, and then it seems like we have years and years of backsliding. And I've always tried to understand, why is it so easy to go backwards and so hard to go forward, it seems to me. And I'm just curious, from the 13th Amendment comes up frequently in your book. And what lessons would you draw for us in this moment? Remember, we're in a moment, like if we just take the last 5 years, we come from the murder of George Floyd and the demonstrations that happen across the country and the renewed interest in understanding our current moment and how we got here in terms of race relations, if you will. And then suddenly now in North Carolina, a state where our legislature is banning whatever they understand DEI to mean, where they're threatening to make it a criminal offense, where they're threatening to impeach public officials who are willing to even talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it feels like we've gone way backwards really quickly when it took us so long to get just a little bit further. What lessons would you draw for us?
I guess the first one, and it follows directly from this discussion, you know, that in many ways the past is hardly past, right? And that we live with it, we tell it, we make sense of the world through it. And so I think the myth that what progress looks like is a distancing from the past, right, is getting farther and farther away, almost so that the time before the 13th Amendment sort of fades, and it is, I think, naive, right? The past is with us for ways that might be laudable, are oftentimes difficult, but we live as, you know, millennia of humans have lived, making sense of our world by bringing the past with us and thinking through the past. So my way forward, and what this book permitted me to do in a very intimate way, was just to immerse myself in that past, was just to know it and have it be thoroughly a part of who I am. And I think my family hoped I was writing one of those books that was going to glorify us, you know. I was going to say, you know, pardon me, Justice, we were light, bright, and always right. We were just the best. And there are books like that. You know them. You've probably read some of them. And I was sure that for me, and I think for many of us, the way forward is full immersion in this past. And there are people in this book whom I have known, who have made my life, who I had to think again. People who I really put on the pedestal, who I had to take down, right? And really understood who they were. This is a book that talks about passing, about colorism. These are difficult subjects that were not spoken of in my family. So for me, there was something extraordinary. The book opens with the words from a spiritual, again, many of you will know them, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's going to trouble the water. Now, the trouble, one meaning of trouble is evident in this book, but that passage, which is from the book of John, trouble is about healing. Right? In the book of John, the angels trouble the waters. And when we step into those waters, when we wade in, when we immerse ourselves, we are healed. We are made whole. And for me, immersing myself in this past, the good, the bad, the ugly, as we say, transformed me. And it was because there are no more secrets, there are no more lies, there are no more ellipses. And for me, that turns out to be a way forward. So if that is a metaphor for our local troubles, our national troubles, I think the message is that I believe we're actually capable of stepping into those troubled waters, of knowing them, of being immersed in them, and to coming out whole on the other side, of being healed, but we have to be willing to step in. And I think so much of what we see, as you describe, right, is we dip a toe in and then we pull back, right? We go to our knees and we step out and dry off, right, and get warm. And I think for me, the lesson was, no, you have to all the way in, right? You've got to wade all the way in. And then maybe you can come out on the other side. This book taught me a sense of humor. I never had a sense of, my friend Al Brophy is here. Al knows I'm many things, but I'm not funny. Al is funny. I am not. But I learned a sense of humor about so much that in my life was painful for a very long time. And I think that is the possibility of immersing ourselves in the past.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Are there any questions from the audience? Does anyone want to raise a question? Okay.
So we don't have a mic, and we don't let the perfect get in the way of the possible. So speak up, if you will, and we'll proceed.
Good morning, and thank you for being here, and thank you for opening up this conversation. So you say race and color are different. So let's talk about blood. In a nation that identifies most people of mixed races as one or the other, but their blood would say something totally different. So I just wonder, I have two questions. One, do you ever see the elimination of color to define race in America? And then the second one is, can we move beyond the after effects of slavery in America?
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us about, I think, how we live with the legacies of ideas. Some of them in this book are really ideas that are generated by a long, long history of scientific racism. In this book, I write about a very enduring theory called mulatto degeneracy. The theory that dates all the way back to the 1840s at least, the view that so-called mixed race people were physically, biologically inferior to so-called pure people. That mixed race people were destined to lose their ability to procreate, destined to extinction. And there's a great deal of not only ink spent, but social, biological science, anthropological science, and more. A lot of energy spent on proving and disproving this theory over the course of time. You know, my bottom line to your question is summed up in a line that I'll borrow from my friend Jelani Cobb, who, when commenting on, some of you will remember the dust up over a woman named Rachel Dolezal. And Jelani said, well, you know, really, how upset can we be with Rachel Dolezal? You know, it was just a lie about a lie. A lie about a lie, right? A lie about a lie. And I think that's what partly this book taught me, and that's where the sense of humor comes from, finally, right, is that we have all been bamboozled, right, by these intersecting stories, right, about race, about color, about blood. Today, and I'm not someone who has joined in this, but today we could add genetics, right, DNA, and that we have been lied to and bamboozled with perniciously so for a very long time. So I'm not someone who could sit here and say to you, you know, this is no post-racial America, right? We know that, but it is important for us to live and breathe the truth that all of that was a lie, and it has been perpetrated on us for generations, and we must call it out when it's a lie. One of the interesting things about this book is that I rarely ascribe labels to people, color labels or race labels. I describe people as they were described, or we see photographs. But I really wanted to resist the language, the nomenclature that we use, because it is so slippery and so shady. And I don't, in fact, describe myself in the book, or ascribe an identity to myself, but the reviewers do. And every reviewer feels compelled. Sometimes I'm mixed race, sometimes I'm light-skinned, sometimes I'm white presenting, all the things. And I keep a record of this, just warning you, should you ever have occasion, I will write it down, because I'm fascinated, right, by, even in the 21st century, in a book like this, which is really intended to explode the lie, we need those labels, right, that we believe they mean something essential about us. And so we could talk later about the census. I have a lot to say about all of that. It's an important question, so thank you so much.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's anyone else in the audience. Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have a question around justice. I said for people that do the work like us, related to racial equity and social justice or civil rights today, what legal, educational, or civil strategy do you think are most promising to advancing meaningful change?
Thank you for that. Now, I feel like that is a question for Justice Earls, but I'm going to just say a short thing, and then I do want to hear your answer to that. You know, once upon a time, I was a young lawyer who did work in civil rights and economic justice, and ended my career working with women and their families in the 1980s and 90s, people living with HIV and AIDS. Which is to say, I did work that I got up every day and I understood the fight, the good fight, and I believed every step I took. So what am I doing here today telling you I've written a book, right? And I'm wearing these heels, right? You can't fight the good fight in these heels. Maybe you can. I can. But I'm still a storyteller, right? And I think for me, appreciating the power of storytelling, and in particular historical storytelling, I think is really for me is one of those tools, one of those instruments, one of those weapons in the fight for justice. And so I understand the stories I tell as, I hope, right, on a good day, the stories I tell are stories that folks are able to pick up and use in the world to do the work that you do. And so I hope there's a continuity there. But I want to hear what Justice Earls would say about where we are.
Right, strategies. I say we need all of them. And just pick the one that you have the most passion for. In other words, the most important thing is that we are at a moment when we cannot be silent. We cannot be silent about what we see going on around us. We cannot be silent about what is happening to our neighbors. We have to stand up for what we believe in and what our values are, and there's so many different ways to do that. The legal advocacy is only one way. I think through our culture, through our music, through our arts, through our everyday interactions, we just cannot be silent. So with that, I do want to give you, Professor Jones, the opportunity to answer the question you wanted me to ask, but I didn't. Or in other words, if there's anything you want to leave us with. And I'll let you all know that you can hear more from her this evening at 6 o'clock at Flyleaf Books. She'll be reading from her book. So more opportunity to learn from the incredible gift that you have given us. But are there any closing words you want to say?
Just to thank everybody for being here. It's really an honor. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
So, one thing I did want to mention as people are getting to their seats, you know, one of the things that we did as a part of this effort, that's, well, it may not be very important to everybody, but it's very important to me, and I think some others, is we have an Abolition Day book list, and we have an Abolition Day playlist, and they both, you know, it was our intent to have some of the music playing, you know, during this event, but there are some technology challenges, and so we didn't do that. But if you'll notice on the program and on the bookmarks, there's a QR code for both lists, and I would commend them to you. And I also, you know, I mentioned the Chapel Hill Public Library and their community, you know, education group. That's a key part of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition in terms of our partnerships and coalitions. And Molly Luby is just a rock star. She's with that department at the library, and she is the one who compiled and put the QR code for the music and the book list. So I do want to thank her for that. So, and she's seated right there, y'all. So, so looking forward to this panel. And I will leave it to the moderator to do the brief introductions. Our moderator this morning is none other than the amazing Paris Miller-Fouché. She's many things, but two of the more important is that, you know, she's a member of the Chapel Hill Town Council. And she's also a key member of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. In fact, is a member of our programming committee. So, Paris.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, and good morning and welcome, everyone. Today we gather on a profound anniversary, 160 years since the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished chattel slavery in the United States. This history is not a distant chapter. It is the bedrock of our present, shaping our institutions, our disparities, and our nation's soul. Today's conversation is an essential part of that reckoning and understanding. And to guide us through this vital exploration, I have the distinct honor of introducing an extraordinary panel of scholars and thinkers, and their work illuminates different facets of this pivotal moment, from the national political fight to the local reality of life in 1865, from the spiritual sanctuary of the church to the legal legacies we live with. Please join me in welcoming, in the order of their remarks, we have Dr. Reginald Hildebrand, who's a historian, who will be exploring 1865, the first year of freedom in North Carolina. Dr. Hildebrand is a retired professor of African American Studies and History at UNC Chapel Hill and Durham Technical Community College. He's also the author of The Times Were Strange and Stirring, Methodist Preachers and the Crisis of Emancipation. Dr. Antoine Hunter, who will ground us in the arduous political journey of the ratification process itself. Dr. Hunter is on the history faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, is an expert of slavery and freedom in the United States. His first book, A Precarious Balance, Firearms, Race, and Community in North Carolina, 1929 to 1865, examines the community and legal dynamics of Black people's historic gun use. We have Mr. Michael Williams, a Stagville Historic Site Board Chair, who will connect the abstract to the human through the lens of abolition and the specific history of Stagville. Mr. Williams is a direct descendant of Stagville freedmen with lineage reaching into the 18th and 16th centuries. He pairs lived history with professional expertise. He's a trained adjunct genealogical instructor focused on applied genetic genealogy and the design of DNA memory projects for plantation descendant communities. He's also a 2011 graduate of the landmark Roots into the Future initiative by 23andMe, co-chaired by Dr. Rick Kittles and Dr. Henry Louis Gates. And Professor Irving Joyner, law professor, who will bring us into the present and future by examining the afterlives of slavery and the enduring quest for liberation. Dr. Joyner, a professor of law at North Carolina Central University, and I said North Carolina Central University, any Eagles in the house, of School of Law, and has taught at the law school since 1982, where his teaching focuses on race and the law, civil rights, criminal law, and criminal procedure. He's the chair of the Legal Redress Committee for the North Carolina NAACP and is a litigator, advocate in voters' rights and political participation. He's also the co-host of the highly acclaimed Legal Eagle Review, which is broadcast each Sunday evening on WNCU 90.7 FM. We have structured our time to allow each panelist to lay a foundation in the area of focus, after which we will move into a fluid discussion, drawing connections between these powerful perspectives, and we will conclude, of course, with questions for you, if time permits, our engaged audience. Let's begin. Dr. Hildebrand, the time is yours.
Thank you, Moderator Miller-Fushi. I'm old enough to have done a few of these things. I've never worked with a moderator who has been more conscientious about her task and trying to engage the panelists and make sure that things went smoothly. I thank you and respect that. Thank you for your kindness to me, too. On the first day of freedom, a mother called her children to come to her, and she held them. And then she looked at them, and she knew. For the very first time, she knew that those little lives that she loved with a mother's love could not be sold away from her. That's what freedom meant. On the first day of freedom, husbands embraced their wives and wives embraced their husbands, knowing for the first time that a slave trader could not separate them from each other, and that love, the Lord, and now also the law could bind them together until death did them part. On that first morning of freedom, men and women got up as they had every other morning, but for the very first time in their lives, they could say that this body, my body, belongs to me and my God and no one else. That's what freedom meant. But it came at different times and in different ways in this state during 1865, the first year of freedom. The passage from slavery to freedom was profound and exhilarating, but it was not simply a celebration. In February 1865, a regiment of black Union soldiers marched into Wilmington, bringing freedom to its enslaved population. One of those black soldiers wrote about what he saw and felt on that day. He wrote, "At the appearance of our troops and the old flag, the people gathered. I noticed an old man and woman, both seemed to be lame, singing and giving God the praise to see this day. They said they had been praying so long, yet thought they might die without this sight. And they thanked God that the day had come when they were not to be driven to market to be sold as sheep. The children shouted and clapped their hands. I was indeed speechless." But what happens when those soldiers get orders to move on to another place and leave behind the people whose freedom had been made secure by their presence? The war was not over. Vengeful Confederate soldiers were still in the area and could return. A black chaplain recalled how the exhilaration of emancipation was followed not long after by anxiety and desperation. He wrote, "Sunday, the 9th, orders came to march early in the morning, everything being in a hustle to get ready to leave in the shortest time possible. The news spread among the inhabitants of the place. The whites were evidently glad, while the colored were sorrowful and despondent. Men, women, and children had come for miles from the adjacent countryside to find freedom. There were hundreds of children who could not go with us, women in the same fix. Vast numbers thought it impractical to attempt to follow us, but to remain there was thought to be death, for the scouts of the rebel General Wheeler were expected in as soon as we left. To describe the scene produced by our departure would be too solemn. Suffice it to say, many were the tears shed, vast numbers followed us at every risk. Where they all are now, God alone knows. I was compelled to evade their sight as much as possible, to be relieved of such words as these: 'Chaplain, what shall I do? Where can we go? Will you come back?' Amid it all, we marched off. Not all the Union troops were protectors. In June, another black Union soldier made this observation about some white officers and troops. In Goldsboro, in this state, black men are robbed almost daily. On Monday of this week, not less than 6 were chased by soldiers and robbed of all their money and watches. On that same day, in the same place, London Johnston, a colored Methodist brother from New Jersey, who was preaching and teaching school here, was robbed of $20 and all his clothes, except what he had on. His life has been threatened if he does not stop, and I quote, teaching niggers. He was about to give up his school when I happened to call upon him and spoke an encouraging word. His school numbers more than 300 pupils. Here in Raleigh, the white people are running the colored people off their lot because they attend school. We can furnish the names if required. Let me repeat what I have said before. If the whites here had or could have their way, there would not be a free colored man in the state. In the following month, July, another important milestone was passed. The 4th of July, 1865, was the first Independence Day after emancipation had given more inclusive meaning to the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." On that day, formerly enslaved people were the greatest patriots in this state. A black pastor wrote this letter describing Independence Day in Raleigh. The 4th of July was one of the happiest days the colored citizens ever experienced. The procession was very large and grand. Many persons came in from the country. 10, 15 miles around, the line of march went through the principal streets, passing the governor's mansion. Prayer being offered by Reverend M.G. Groom, the Declaration of Independence was read. It was indeed a well-written document, sublime and eloquent. The deafening applause during its delivery said how it was received and appreciated by the waving mass of human beings whose hearts beat in response to the great truths uttered by the speaker. So the first 4th of July for the thousands of freedmen closed without a single thing occur to mar their peace. But then the pastor also made some observations about general conditions in North Carolina. He wrote, "We are sorry to say that the same reports we read every week of the cruel treatment of our people in certain districts of the South can be made of this state. Many have been kept at work while the crops were gathered, until the crops were gathered, under the promise of pay, either in money or part of the crop. But when the time came for reward, they were simply driven off. Then, in September, an extraordinary meeting convened in Raleigh. It was a convention of black North Carolinians coming together to talk and plan about the best ways to define and secure freedom. This report appeared in the Christian Recorder newspaper. The convention of the colored people of North Carolina, so long expected, so novel to the white people, met here today. Probably 150 delegates. Upon taking the chair, the President J.W. Hood said there had never been before, and there would probably never be again, so important an assemblage of the colored people of North Carolina. They had assembled from the hillside and the mountains and the valleys to consult together upon the best interests of the colored people. Their watchwords, equal rights before the law. These are the rights we will contend for, and these the rights we will have, God being our helper. Later in the fall, a black soldier wrote this disheartening account of things he had observed in the eastern part of the state. Months after emancipation was supposed to have taken effect. He wrote, "I found many of the colored people did not know that they were free until I told them. But I can readily account for this, for during the past 4 years, many were not allowed to go away from their master's plantations, and if they were discovered in attempting to get away, they were caught and brought back and punished with 39 lashes on the back, and in some instances were shot dead." That soldier was in New Bern sometime later, an area that had been occupied by Union forces since 1862, giving freedom there some time to take root. It was one poignant example of what could have been. He wrote, "I then went to New Bern, and there I found the colored people doing very well indeed. I found some 10 or 15 occupying stores and buying and selling just as their old masters used to do. Some of them are owners of farms, and I have been told that some of them have cleared over $400. and these same people were but a few years ago slaves. We have now reached the end of 1865, the first year of freedom. A minister in Raleigh wrote about the watch night religious service he attended as people welcomed in the new year. I spent my New Year's in Raleigh, the minister wrote. It was a new year long to be remembered. This was the first new year the people here had enjoyed. They had the blessed consolation of no longer being brought under the auction hammer and sold or hired to the highest bidder. But he also made this observation. I am sorry to say these people are still somewhat oppressed by their former masters. Still, they are stemming the current and hoping for a better day. Before I close, I want you to hear the words of one other witness to the coming of freedom. There was an announcement published in the Christian Recorder in April 1866. Its words haunt me. The carefully worded announcement came from a quite remarkable woman named Hagar Outlaw. She was trying to find her children who had been sold away from her during slavery years earlier. Now she was old and nearing the end of her life. She just wanted to know where they were and what had become of them. She wanted to know if she had grandchildren and what they were like. So I imagine that she must have asked a preacher or a teacher or an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau to write out the announcement and submit it to the newspaper for her. She gave them the information and listened carefully as to how they worded it to make sure it said what she wanted to say. It was a long shot, a hope against hope. But the Christian Recorder was distributed in African Methodist churches across the South and to most places in the nation where there was a black community. So maybe it would be read by somebody who knew something about her children and could get word to them. Her announcement read as follows: information wanted of the children of Hagar Outlaw, who were taken from Wake Forest. 3 of them, their names being Cherry, Vinnie, and Mills Outlaw, were bought by Abram Hester. Noah Outlaw was taken to Alabama by Joseph Turner. John Outlaw was sold to George Vaughn. Julia Outlaw was sold in New Orleans by Dr. Outlaw. I live in Raleigh, and I hope they will think enough of their mother to come and look for her, as she is growing old and needs help. She will be glad to see them again at her side. I wish to see my dear ones once more. Come to the capital of North Carolina, and you will find your mother there. And then she added another sentence at the end, almost as a postscript. It was a message aimed directly at her former master, Dr. Hugh Outlaw. Slavery had done its worst to this old woman. It had taken most of her life and all of her children. She had lived long enough to see slavery end and the world of her former master turned upside down. She had survived, and there was almost a sense of triumph, an expression of strength and dignity, of restrained indignation in her carefully worded last sentence, directed at the man who had owned her and sold away her children. He probably knew something about where her children were. He certainly knew what he had put her through. Hugh Outlaw, the last sentence began. She made a point not to call him doctor or even mister. certainly not master. Things had changed, and she wanted him to know it. You outlaw, if you should find any or all of my children, you will do me an incalculable favor by immediately informing them that their mother still lives. In that simple sentence, I hear that lady say to her former master and to the whole system of oppression that was designed to reduce her to property. In those words, I can hear her saying, "You have done your worst, but I am still here. I still have some strength, and I still have my dignity and my humanity, and a mother's love for her children cannot be destroyed." She says simply, tell them that their mother still lives. I don't know if Hagar Outlaw got to see her children again before she died, but I hope that by recalling her words, she has lived again for a few moments here, speaking to all of us, helping us understand and appreciate the meaning of freedom. Thank you.
Wow.
The becoming of freedom. Freedom does not explain what it means to gain and maintain freedom. Thank you, Dr. Hildebrand, for that powerful grounding in the lived reality of 1865 and for showing us what the first year of freedom meant on the ground in North Carolina. And of course, that pivotal year was only possible because of the monumental political and constitutional battle that preceded it. And to take us inside that crucial process, we now turn to Dr. Antoine Hunter.
Thank you. Thanks to the folks who put this together, and also thanks to all of you for coming out on a very cold Saturday morning to, I think, commemorate an event that that's worth commemorating and worth talking about, worth remembering, both historically and I think in the ways that we still grapple with some of the foundational questions that it raises. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the ratification process. And so in a nutshell, starting in December of 1863, there were radical politicians in the Republican Party in both the United States Senate and in the House that are starting to craft and propose bills to emancipate the enslaved folks in the, at this point, U.S. South. There are a couple bills that are floated out. Some of them are melded together, but I want to make reference to one in particular. In January of 1864, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, he proposes a constitutional amendment that would declare that all persons were essentially equal before the law, and as such, no one person could hold another in bondage. It would be a violation of that sort of innate equality in people. And for those of you not familiar with Charles Sumner, he has a long, storied career as someone in the Senate who's fighting for, we might call them progressive values, but sort of fighting against slavery, critiquing slavery's extension, critiquing those Congress folks who support it and bolster it and defend it in the House. And so that bill is one of many that are floating around, and the Senate Judiciary Committee does not take that one. It crafts a different amendment from a couple of proposals that are put forth. And those also call for the end of slavery, but also add, they include the exception for the, quote, punishment of crimes, right, that slavery or servitude could continue, involuntary servitude could continue in those instances. And this is often debated, and there are historians today who still disagree about what this means and what it effectively does, but I'll suffice to say here that it is essentially replicating the wording from the Northwest Ordinance which is a long story, but it's in 1787, the Confederation Congress puts together this thing to kind of organize what's now the Midwest, so what used to be the old Northwest. In it, they bar slavery from those territories north of the Ohio River, but they leave this sort of clause there attached to it. And so the version of the amendment that passes through the U.S. Senate in April of 1864 is essentially this one, but it stalls in the House of Representatives. The congressmen in the House cannot come to terms on this, even with President Lincoln's support. And there are a couple of factors that go into this, and I'll mention just a couple. So one of them is that for many Northern Democrats, they look at this idea of an emancipation measure, this idea of constitutionally banning slavery as a step too far for the federal government to engage in, right? In this period, and still in our own day, there are a lot of folks who will make the argument for states' rights in various capacities. And one of them is this question of slavery. There are folks who believe that this is a state prerogative, and if states want to abolish slavery and emancipate the enslaved people there, that's their prerogative. But this is not a power for the federal government to meddle with. And there are others who fearmonger, and who I think some of them are genuinely afraid, but others just using it as a boogeyman. But there's this fear that, well, if you emancipate the enslaved people in the United States, then what becomes of them? Do they become citizens? Do they get other rights? And while I would say certainly yes, that would be a great idea, there are many folks in this period who would be nervous about the idea, right? Even some folks who might support emancipation certainly don't support the idea of black equality. And so there are a couple things that kind of move this measure forward and help it to get ratified. One of them is that the 1864 election ends in Lincoln's victory, right? And this is an election that is incredibly important. We can talk about big elections in American history. I mean, think about this for a moment. In the midst of the U.S. Civil War, there was an election where the president who was trying to maintain the Union is up for, his seat is up. He's up for election. And it would be easy to sort of to sweep it away and say, well, you know, we can't really have an election now. I'm just going to stay here. He doesn't do it. He says, we're a free nation. We're going to have an election. And the folks who are running against him, they're folks who are talking about making peace or trying to find some way to end the war. And Lincoln is committed to seeing it through to the end. So the election is very important. But one of the other pieces of it that is also crucially important is that the Republican Party's platform in 1864 is far more, I would use the word progressive, but it's far more, it takes a much firmer stance on slavery than the 1860 platform does. And so in it, the platform declares that, and I quote, that if slavery was the cause and now constitutes the strength of this rebellion, and as it must be, always and everywhere, hostile to the principles of Republican government, justice and the national safety demand its utter and complete extirpation from the soil of the Republic, right? Slavery must be done with, right? This is a part of the party's platform. It goes further to say that the party is in favor of an amendment that would, quote, terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery within the limits and the jurisdiction of the United States. And so when Lincoln wins the election, standing on this platform, it adds some fuel to the fire of actually getting a constitutional amendment put forward. This is the platform the party ran on. This is the one that passes, or that wins the election. And so Lincoln also pushes this issue in his State of the Union. It's in December of '64. He reminds folks, right, that coming in to the new year, that emancipation was going to be an important part of his administration. And so there's a flurry of lobbying. There are some promises made, political favors granted, some pork that is sort of passed around. And there's, we can talk about this. There are probably also some bribes that are paid to some of the folks in Congress. But nonetheless, the House finally passes the amendment in January of '65. And it reads, the text here, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It's a strong statement, but we might either sort of edit it if we had the opportunity. But nonetheless, this is a moment, right? There are people cheering and celebrating in the galleries up on Capitol Hill when this happens, right? Professor Hildebrand talks about the response to people in around the country, in North Carolina, right? There's a celebration. People have been waiting for this. There have been generations of folks fighting, people putting in blood, sweat, and tears, some people literally giving their lives for this idea of emancipation, this idea that slavery shall not exist in the United States. And this is the moment where it happens. It's a beautiful moment. Still, however, I would point out that there are some congressmen who oppose the passage of this amendment. Just by way of an example, you have Representative Chilton White, an Ohio Democrat, who argued against it. And his basic point is this idea that, the master-slave relationship is really one that boils down to property, right? That an enslaver has the right in the labor of this person that he has, claimed control over, claimed mastery over, claimed ownership over. And that you can't just take this away from people without due process. And for him, due process is a trial, right, by jury, right? That's the only way that you can take away people's right to the labor of the people they've enslaved. And he also believes that if you were going to do that, after this due process, those people must be compensated, right? You cannot just deprive them of this labor. And so folks like Chilton White recognize that individual states could abolish slavery on their own accord, but reject this idea that the federal government should step in and do so. And so he argues that an enslaver's right to the labor of the people they've enslaved is, quote, clearly and distinctly defined by the law, and is also, quote, clearly and distinctly recognized by the Constitution of the United States. Now, despite these lingering reservations from folks like Chilton White, Congress sends the amendment to the states for ratification in February of 1865. And this process is a little bit tricky, right? So there are 36 states at this point in time in the Union, and you need 27 of them to certify it in order for the amendment to pass or to be ratified by the states. And so to add another layer to this complication, of course, the war is still going on. And so while there are 36 states in the Union, there are 11 of them who essentially want no part of anything that the United States is doing at this point in time. And so for the first few weeks of this process, many of those states are still in rebellion. And then even afterwards, after the rebellion has been quelled, they're still in disarray. They're still coming back together. We're still figuring out what their place is within the nation. And so, of course, as we're all familiar, Lincoln is assassinated in April. Andrew Johnson takes over the executive branch. And under his watch, the former Confederate states are required to accept the 13th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union. Some of them certified with the expectation that the federal government will essentially emancipate enslaved people, but no more, right? That is the end of this experiment, right? Yes, emancipation, slavery is done, but as far as giving form to what that freedom means for enslaved folks, that's not the federal government's responsibility. That will fall onto the states, which, as you can imagine, would create some challenges, as we'll see, with Reconstruction. And so the amendment is ultimately ratified exactly 160 years ago today, as Georgia became the 27th of 36 approving states necessary for ratification on December 6, 1865. And it's worth noting North Carolina also certified the amendment 2 days earlier on December 4th. I guess it was Thursday. And so I want to make a couple quick notes to contextualize this, and then I'll get out of your hair. So Lincoln really saw this amendment as a priority for his administration, and he worked hard to drum up support in Congress, right? And so if you watch Steven Spielberg's Lincoln movie, right, the big push in that, it's this story, right? Lincoln pushing to get the 13th Amendment passed. But I would add that the 13th Amendment is only one chapter in the story of emancipation. And so for some folks, the opening story to that is the Emancipation Proclamation, right, that Lincoln passes, or Lincoln issues earlier. And I would argue that, yes, that is a very important piece of this. I think that Lincoln is a very important piece of this. Lincoln is one of my favorite presidents. I have a bust of Lincoln in my office, along with a bust of Frederick Douglass. But one of the things that I always try and emphasize to folks is that Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and yes, we can argue that's the beginning of this, but I would argue that he is really behind the curve in a lot of ways on this. He's my favorite president not because I see him as a great emancipator. I see him as a president who steers us through the Civil War. But I would argue the Civil War is it's an incredibly crucial moment in American history that I think we could learn a lot from. But I think that to me, the emancipation story begins with a host of other people who are not Abraham Lincoln, right? And so if we think about their army officers like David Hunter in Carolina and Georgia, Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe, all of these officers who try and issue emancipation orders or get to free enslaved folks during the war. You also have Congress people. Congress ends slavery in D.C. The slave trade ended in 1850, but there were still slaves in D.C. During the summer of '62, Congress says no more slavery in D.C., and they compensate the slaveholders, right? Later in '62, they end slavery in the U.S. territories. No more slavery in the territories. No compensation for slaveholders. But the thing that I would sort of point to, or the group that I would point to, is that enslaved people themselves force these questions on the government. And so through flight, through people just running away and showing up at army camps, running away and heading to the north, running away and basically making army officers and politicians have to reckon with the question of emancipation, I think they force this issue. And so 13th Amendment is a great part of the legacy. The Emancipation Proclamation is a great part of the legacy. But I would say don't forget the enslaved people on the ground who sort of like forced the government's hand on a lot of these things. I will stop there, about probably a little over time, and I will pass the torch. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. I want to do, okay, great. I just wanted to make sure you all could hear me through the mic. Thank you, Dr. Hunter, for illuminating the high-stakes political machinery that made emancipation the law of the land. But as we just heard from Dr. Hildebrand, and as you've underscored, laws are felt by people in specific places. And to understand how the national decree transformed life on a specific historic landscape, we are fortunate to be joined by Mr. Michael Williams to guide us through what abolition meant at the Staggville Historic Site, once one of North Carolina's largest plantations.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Ms. Fauché, for your support throughout this process and preparing for this moment, this conversation, and to be in the company of such distinguished scholars. James, you and your team, thank you for the invitation and for putting together such a wonderful program. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to go to Mike Wiley's event yesterday, but I mean, it was terrific. And I honor those of you in the audience, who are distinguished men and women. Thank you for your leadership. Being here today is really a full circle moment for me. Yes, abolition and what that meant for the folks at Staggville, my ancestors at Staggville. You're looking at a 10th generation descendant. My roots go back to the 18th and 19th century at Staggville. And one of my ancestors, Cato, was formerly owned by Thomas Ruffin and was sold to Richard Benahan. So that's how far back my lineage goes across the Goodloe and Justice and Jordan family lines, are those direct bloodlines. But I'll never forget the opportunity that I had when I went to the Wilson Library looking at the Southern Historical Collection in the Cameron Papers, and I pulled out an 1865 labor contract. And looking at the names, and I can see my Goodloe ancestors, but there was one other person in particular that stands out as it connects to abolition and freedom and what happens next. And there's a man by the name of Paul Hargis. This is a person who was written about in the book White Plantation, Black Homeland by Dr. Sid Nathans. And what's interesting about this particular character is that he not only worked alongside of my ancestors on the Eno complex, but he was a part of a whole diaspora when we think of Staggville, because Staggville wasn't just North Carolina's premier commercialized plantation, but there was a diaspora that reached as far out as Mississippi, Tunica, Mississippi, and Greene County, Alabama. And so, as I began to learn about the history of Stagville and what it meant, and when it came time for Freedom Time, I had to do a lot of reading. I'm thinking about Dr. Herbert Gutman's, foundational work, which helped prepare me to really understand the various familial networks that made Stagville work and the labor that came out of Stagville. I'm thinking of Dr. Gene Anderson's work, the Piedmont Plantation, which was so insightful. And then, of course, Dr. Sid Nathan's books, To Free a Family, talking about the Mary Walker story. She was a formerly enslaved woman who actually escaped to Philadelphia. Well, while she was in Philadelphia, she made her escape from Paul Cameron. And even though she had to leave her family behind, she eventually was able to network her way by meeting William Steele and so many others who were a part of the Underground Railroad network to be able to coordinate a rescue effort, and eventually was able to free her family. So again, this idea of freedom and what comes next. I do know, in looking at the Cameron papers, that there was a little bit of a labor strike, if you will. And I love how Dr. Nathans talks about this in the book White Plantation, Black Homeland, because they had their pitchforks or whatever equipment that they had in their hand. They said, we are not laboring not another day unless we get a third of the crops. And so there was a regiment stationed in Raleigh, I think the 112th Regiment. Paul Cameron reached out to them and said, we need you to come here and mediate this because it's become too chaotic. And literally, the workers refused to work a single minute. And so the mediation that occurred was effective enough to kind of help lay the proper expectation of what freedom meant. And I want to read that to you, if I may. And so it's really, really powerful. This is coming from the Cameron papers. And it says the following post. Okay. Just a moment. There it is. Okay. All right. So I want to say Major Hollister wrote this. In obedience to orders from corporate headquarters, I have the honor to submit the following report. I visited Mr. Paul Cameron and his plantation and found all as stated in his letter. The freedmen were entirely disorganized and uncontrollable. They considered that they had they considered that they had an equal right to the proceeds of their former labor with their old master and were disposed to appropriate accordingly. I instructed them as follows: that government had made them free, but that it gave them nothing more. That they had no claim on the property of the planter, the taking of which was theft and subject to severe and dire punishment. That in the present condition of the country, they were dependent upon their former master for support, and that it was desired they should remain where they were and labor for such share or proportion as they and he should agree, and that they could not expect much at present. All seemed well disposed and willing, and were only disorganized through ignorance of their real situation. With proper care on the part of their overseers, there will be little, if any, to be apprehended from them. And so I remember reading that and thinking about my 3 times great-grandparents, Daniel Goodloe and Mariah Justice, who were listed on that 1865 labor contract, and thinking, what in the world were they going to do? Because shortly after that incident, Paul Cameron evicted all of them and brought in white tenant labor farmers to move in and take their place. Now, there were a sprinkling, because there was such a network of plantation complexes. When we think about Stagville, there was about maybe 8 or so, and that's just in the North Carolina, portion. And my folks were on the Eno-Farintosh. And so it's really something. And so what ended up happening is that you find these freed people coming together, figuring out a way to create these intentional communities of self-upliftment, of economic autonomy. And that in and of itself is a form of abolition, community abolition, an ethos that really says, for us, by us. And so we have this concept of these Black intentional communities that arises, community examples like Bragtown, like Hayti, Walltown, Central Park. These are communities that many of you here either have researched or heard about or even read about. And what's beautiful about it is that there are descendant groups today. And so my ascension to the Historic Stagville Foundation is truly full circle, because through the foundation, we get to support the State Historic Stagville site. And so the site management and Vera Zizelski and her team, we have really come together to really bring a lot of this information forward. Because you see, Stagville is considered to be one of the few sites of consciousness in this country. And what does that mean, being a site of conscious? They have together we have the arduous task of funding and supporting programming that allows for the community to really take a close look at the historic and institutional injustices there through truth-telling and centering the story of the enslaved community there. And so there's something to be said when we think about the racial injustices that we are experiencing now and historically. Ground zero for all of that is the plantation. And so I'm inspired by what Brian Stevenson says, and I'll say this in closing. He actually said this: if we as a nation want to get to something better, we as a nation must do something remedial. And the community, all stakeholder groups convening at places, sites of consciousness like Stagville, we get to really come together as a collective and to really grapple with this history and to figure out what is the best way forward as a perfect union. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, for rooting this history so powerfully in a place we can visit and remember and organize. You've helped us feel the weight of that transition on the very soul where enslavement occurred, and that history is not confined to the past. Its legacies are actively shaping our present. And to bring our discussion squarely into the now and the future, we will conclude with Professor Irving Joyner, who will examine the enduring structures and the sobering truth captured in his topic, The Afterlives of Slavery. We are not free yet. I'm looking at the time. You're good with time. We are good with time, but I do want to be able to pose at least one question to the entire panel to be able to respond to and hopefully leave a little bit of time for you beautiful people out here. Professor Joyner.
Thank you. Thank you for being here on this very cold day in this very cold place. We appreciate your not only being here, but staying here as we work through this conversation. First of all, I want to just thank James Williams for his work in putting all of this together. I was at the Capitol on Thursday for the celebration of North Carolina's participation in the enactment of the 13th Amendment. December 4th was the date, and we were in the place where the legislature made the decision to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And then, of course, 2 days later, it was formally ratified with 27 of the 35 states that were in existence at the time. So that was a very warm occasion. The 13th Amendment is the law of the land. It was, I think, referred to as a radical enactment at the time. And indeed, it is a radical notion today. We have, on the one hand, a governmental declaration that the 13th Amendment is the law of the land, but there was not an affirmation by the people that that law was something that they were bound to respect. And in fact, it produced a lot of resistance that was already in place, resistance that would continue from that point, and resistance that is present in our government today. A government that is, for the first time in our history, actively working to undo and unravel the very tenets of the 13th Amendment. Never before in the history that I've been a part of, and I've been around for a few minutes, has the government led a campaign to undo that we hold so near and dear to our hearts. And there are strong supporters on the side of changing or reinterpreting what is meant by the 13th Amendment, the law of the land. It's also important for us to remember that while the law is the law and should be respected, that it means absolutely nothing when those who are in power are not inclined to enforce it. If you have a government of people who are intent on ignoring or dismantling what we know to be the law of the land, then the law of the land is meaningless. We are at that point where we look at our federal government and we look at our state government and we perceive an orchestrated campaign to undermine those tenets of what we call the law of the land. And it begins with this notion of the 13th Amendment, goes further into what we refer to as the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment and other amendments of importance to all of us. But if the people who are in charge of enforcing the law decline to enforce it, then what value is the law of the land? And we see in this place that we are in today, in this space that we are in today, from the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, an active campaign to reinterpret the focus and the scope, the power and the longevity of those things that we cling to be the law of the land. And I think that we have to pay a lot of attention to that notion. And what is it that we need to do to restore that respect for the law and our interpretation of what the law means? As it relates to, well, let me just kind of walk back through my credentials. I am a son of the South. My family grew up in the enslavement in North Carolina. We trace our family history, as far as we know it, back to 1810 in Lenoir County, North Carolina, which is in the eastern part of the state, where on both sides of my family, and that is with my grandfather and my grandmother, were enslaved on plantations owned by the Joyner family and the Wooten family. And those families were prominent in the development of what became the 1898 Wilmington Massacre, growing out of political involvement out of Goldsboro or Wayne County, North Carolina, part of the Democratic effort to ignore or redefine the power relationship between African Americans and whites in this state. And as you know, that resulted in November 10, 1898, with the Wilmington Massacre. And with the Wilmington Massacre came the destruction of democracy for African Americans in North Carolina. North Carolina at the end of the Civil War was a little different than other southern states. And the Reconstruction effort that occurred in this state lasted longer than it did in other states, mainly because that the history of North Carolina included what we call free Africans. I call them free Africans, but other folks call them free blacks or free coloreds. A substantial population in North Carolina during the enslavement period. And during that period, these individuals were able to own businesses, to participate up until 1835 in the political process in the state, where they could vote, as did other citizens in the state. In 1835, the legislature came together and decided that by close vote, that they would take away the opportunity for those free Africans to vote in this state. So when it became, when we got around to 1865, 1868, when the Freedmen's Convention was held in Raleigh, one of the first things that was a part of that agenda was the right to vote and to participate in the political franchise, along with free education for African Americans, economic freedom and liberation, and the ability to achieve reparations or remunerations, remunerations for the labor in this country. So that was the goal of the African American community coming out of the Civil War period. That was not without opposition. There was stringent resistance to that notion, and a battle that occurred beginning in 1868 and continuing up to 1898 with the Wilmington Massacre, and then in 1900, the redrafting of the North Carolina Constitution, which allowed for the literacy test and taxation on the right to the poll taxes on the right to vote. But a concentrated effort by government to take away the power and authority of African Americans to participate equally in the American franchise, even though at that time and in existence were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and that succeeded. It was successful because those people who were in power were allowed to just disregard the law of the land as it was written in the Constitution and laws of the state. Fast forward to 1964 with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act by the federal government, 1965 with the enactment of the Voting Rights Amendment. Both of those were monumental achievements among African Americans and people, progressive ideas in this state. And we applaud it. We applauded it then, and we applaud it now. Yet its longevity is in question, because ever since it became the law of the land, there has been serious resistance to its enactment. And those provisions, as we look at the intent of the framers of those amendments, have been undermined by judicial decree, by opinions from our court system that seeks now to dismantle the promises of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And sitting now on the table of members of the U.S. Supreme Court is the very life and existence of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we all know that unless you have the power and authority to vote, then all of the other rights that have been claimed by you become meaningless, because you're not in a position to enforce those provisions by placing in power those people who hold near and dear to them the same concepts, precepts, and examples that you hold and cherish among yourself. So we have a country now that is resistant to this notion of the freedom, equality, and justice for those downtrodden within our society. And among those are the African Americans and people of color who now wish to uphold the principles of the Constitution. We have people who have entered the land as immigrants, who are leading the campaign to undermine these constitutional protections. My family was a part of the structure of America long before the Trumps entered the country. Yet now the Trumps and the Trumpettes control our political thought and political actions within this country. And if we don't stand up to fight back against these forces, then we easily go back to a stage where the 13th Amendment becomes no more than a suggestion rather than the law of the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Joyner. It's 12:33, and we will conclude this part of our symposium at 12:45. And so I'm glad we have a little bit of time so I can ask at least one question for this panel to discuss. And I'm like struggling, which one? I guess what I want to pick up what you just put down, Professor Joyner, in terms of the connection and legacy. And so like each of you have detailed a specific pillar of this history, the political fight, the physical site, the enduring legal legacy. And so looking across these pillars, where do you see their forces most clearly intersecting in America's ongoing struggle for true freedom? We've heard a little bit about the labor movement, and I think of unions, voting rights, but also this carceral prison industrial complex. Dr. Hildebrand, you've been quiet down there for a few minutes, and so if you would lead us off, please.
Thank you.
Yes. Yep, there's a mic there.
How do these strands of law and labor, community, come together to meet the present crisis that Professor Joyner has laid out so well? And I think this was also mentioned in in the earlier talk, that all of them, in a sense, coming together to create a community that is hitting on all of those cylinders will be and is and always has been in the past required. An old professor of mine at Howard, Rayford Logan, talked about the nadir of Black history being the period between the 1890s and the early 20th century, when lynching and disfranchisement, when a mockery was being made of the 15th and the 14th Amendment, and segregation was being installed in ways that seemed to undo everything that had been accomplished. And we are, in some sense, revisiting on some level a challenging of things that we thought would not be challenged once we had nailed those down. Once the Civil Rights Act had been passed and the Voting Rights Act had been passed, and once we had affirmed the value of diversity and equity and inclusion, all those seemed to be positive things that were part of our culture and who we were and where we were headed. It is mind-boggling that we're at the point where DEI is a bad word, and that the Supreme Court is considering weakening the Voting Rights Act. What happened, as someone has pointed out, during that period of the nadir was exactly what you have suggested, that communities came together. Institutions like the NAACP were formed during that period. Some fraternities and sororities were organized during that period. Other organizations were formed. Institutions were established to respond to the present danger that they saw then. So it may be, and I think that's the thrust of your question, we're at a moment where we have to look internally. We have to look at building and strengthening and affirming community that will allow us, as happened during the nadir, which laid the foundation for moving out of that period. That's exactly where we are today. This is different in some ways. It's easier in some ways. It's much more challenging because of technology now and what we mean by community and what we mean even by a black community or a progressive community, and how that's influenced, defined, amplified, and distorted by social media, and trying to keep your eyes on the prize and what's real and what isn't is a challenge. But I think the basic values that people brought into the nadir when people were being lynched on a regular basis was to strengthen, deepen community and all those elements to get us through that and lay the foundation for reclaiming all those rights.
Did anyone else want to speak to that?
There is something brewing in my heart. I really think, check one, check two. I really feel that, we just recently lost Mother Viola Fletcher. And for some of you who may not know, she was the last survivor of the Tulsa race riot. Mm-hmm. And it was deeply offensive when the judge, of Oklahoma, I guess the state Supreme Court, pretty much threw the book in her face, this 111-year-old woman, and said, what happened to you and your family had nothing to do with race. That was pretty much the summary. And she just died, not seeing not one drop of justice. 111. She was a super centenarian. I think that was her status. And during the last administration, some of you may recall on C-SPAN, they featured the hearing where I think there was 3 or 4 of those survivors there together, and nothing was done. And a number of administrations sought not to, really use their executive authority to really see. Because see, that right there, is, if we can't take care of home, what business do we have meddling in other nations' business? Is what comes to mind. And so that's why I circle back to sites of conscience like Stagville, because we get to really stand in it, sit in it, and to give space to be inspired to do better. We definitely need a paradigm shift in our country. And we're unified as a constitutional republic, right? And so we want to make sure that the laws that we have, give, a fair and equal opportunity to everyone that is doing their part legally, and give them a path to, if they're not in a state, we're talking about, immigrants who are not documented properly, and to give them a pathway to be able to have that in place so that they can, continue to be productive citizens. And so as a collective, it's also equally important for our immigrant brothers and sisters to understand the history, that really the underlying current of race relations and all of these, different, dichotomies that we have in our society. And so that's what's resonating in my heart right now. We have the opportunity, we can use this moment to create a different narrative, to tell a different story about who we are as Americans.
Thank you so much. It's 12:43. Have to stop at 12:45. I think I have an opportunity for one question, and please make it a question. Any questions? Yes, please.
First of all, before I ask this question, is there anybody in this audience that works for Merck? Okay, so one of the things that I'm lacking hearing is, where are you looking in the business enterprise community? Because Merck is sitting on Cameron legacy land, a billion dollar pharmaceutical company.
That's right.
Stagville should be looking really nice. Really nice. Where are you looking in the business enterprise community? Because Trump understands that it's a financial thing. Trump understands that money is power. Are we leveraging the power in North Carolina, especially in the triangle with the billion-dollar companies, to do something about what we're saying?
Thank you.
Thank you. I can speak to that. Now, this is from the lens of the foundation. I have an incredible team, some of whom are here today, some of the members of the foundation. We have a fundraising committee, and we have repositioned ourselves to be able to start making presentations to companies like Merck and all of those businesses that are part of the Trayburn complex, because that's an important point that you raise. It's time to get them involved. It's time to get them to see the value and what it means to visit a site like Stagville, how it can be an enrichment for the staff at many of these companies, and really kind of create kind of a co-op situation where it's a give and take. It's a give and take. And so as the foundation, we are systematically going through that process to engage these companies and also host them at the site, so they can get the full experience, because it's a new day. And before, the foundation, we've been around since 1978. And so I took the helm in 2023, and not only do we have an incredible level of diversity on the board, which was almost nil, administrations past, but now we've got the talent and the skill to really take this thing to the next level, and I'm really proud of that.
Thank you so much. Mr. James Williams has entered the stage, but before you begin, sir, I would just like to give my closing remarks real quick. First, I just want to thank our brilliant panelists. Can we give them a round of applause? Dr. Hildebrand, Dr. Hunter, Mr. Williams, and Professor Joyner. Thank you all for joining us today. As Professor Joyner's framing, "We are not free yet," resonates with a painful urgency, and it calls us to remember those still caught in the cultural legacies of the 13th Amendment's exception. And it moves me to acknowledge one soul that we just lost, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H. Rap Brown and Black Panther, who's a political prisoner, falsely accused, sentenced to life despite another's confession. He was denied freedom in his life. His story is a stark, modern embodiment of the themes we've discussed today. He is now returned to his Lord, finally free. But his case remains a testament to the work of justice that is ours to do. That work continues here, in remembrance and in action. And my deepest thanks to all of this who've come out today, this audience, to all who have brought this symposium to a vision and fruition, and to all of our sponsors. Let us carry today's lessons forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Great discussion, and thank you, Paris and panelists. And now we are going to proceed with the short, maybe 3 to 5 minute break as we get our second panel seated. And so while that is happening, there are a couple of announcements that I do want to make. We are a little behind schedule, but I think we're good. One is that I want to commend to you the article by Judge Jim Wynn that's on the table on Abolition Day and the 13th Amendment. I think he sums up in a relatively few words the essence of the significance of the day, what it meant then, and what it should mean to us now. So I encourage you to get that document if you don't already have it. I also want to take a minute to thank our planning committee, and that includes Orange County Commissioner Sally Green, who's here with us today. It includes Dr. Freddie Parker, who is also with us today and who you will hear from on this last panel, and Paul Slack of the Orange County Civil Rights Division, and North Carolina Representative Renee Price and myself. So I want to thank them for the work that they put into helping bring this together. And I also want to reference Martin Brown and Treehouse Productions. You may have noticed that we are videotaping this, and it would not have been possible without their generosity in doing this. So let's thank them. So with that.
All right, so here we are at the end of the day, the best part of the day. And so good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank you for joining us as we reflect on the passage of the 13th Amendment, one of the most consequential constitutional milestones in American history, and perhaps one of the most important things that we need to protect today. Okay. So our conversation isn't about rehearsing what we already know. This is the last one, so hopefully everybody in this room knows what the 13th Amendment is by now. How did this amendment reshape the nation? How were the promises contested from the start? And that was answered a little bit in the beginning too. And what its legacy, what does it demand of us today? Very powerful questions that are going through my mind. We're honored to be joined by this really, really extraordinary panel of scholars whose work pushes us to think harder and to look deeper. And so first, I want to introduce Dr. Candace Watts-Smith of Duke University, who is a political scientist and author of Stay Woke, snaps for that. You better stay woke. Whose work reframes civic engagement for this moment that we're in right now. Let's give a hand to Dr. Candace Watts-Smith. Next, I want to introduce Professor Michael Gerhardt of UNC, who is a constitutional law scholar and author of The Law of Presidential Impeachment, which I finished last night, and I have lots of questions, but I'll save that for another conversation. But please give a warm round of applause for Professor Michael Gerhardt. And next, I want to introduce Dr. Timothy B. Tyson, one of my heroes who helped shape my educational philosophy, completing 25 years in the classroom. He is out of Duke University. He is a wonderful historian known for Blood Done Sign My Name and The Blood of Emmett Till, whose work lays bare the continuing struggle for racial justice. Please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Timothy B. Tyson. And finally, I want to introduce Dr. Freddie Parker of North Carolina Central University. And I know now, I have not graduated from Central, but I know I have to pause to give the Eagles fans time to do the yeah. So yes, I'll do it again so that you guys can do it right. Dr. Freddie Parker of North Carolina Central University. Okay. A historian of slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction in North Carolina. Please give a hand to Dr. Freddie Parker. And so I first want to bring up the scholars to say a few words, and then we will get into some conversations. I have many questions. I have circled some of my most poignant questions for the panel. And I know that you guys have some questions too, so let's get right into it. All right, I'm going to call up first Professor Freddie Parker to give his remarks.
Thank you and good afternoon. I just want to start by thanking the young man who I say is the ambassador of programs, that's Brother James Williams, and for leading this effort as he has been doing with OCCRC for several years now, and the other committee members, including Sally Green, who is here with us today. I'm taking a look at the Freedmen's Conventions that took place in 1865 and 1866. Dr. Hildebrand briefly mentioned that this morning, and my hope was that he was going to stop exactly where he stopped. When 200 years of legalized slavery ended in the spring of 1865, black folks right here in North Carolina, probably some of your ancestors, banded together by the summer of 1865 and began discussing their plight, their future after slavery. How do we transition from slavery to freedom? Do we demand the ballot or ask for the ballot? Do we demand or ask for land? Do we ask for a seat at the proverbial table of brotherhood and the literal table where we sit and eat anywhere our money will take us? Do we demand to be taught to read and write in the classroom where white children are educated? Do we demand access to public accommodations, ride on trains, live in your communities? And most importantly, do we demand a piece of land to cultivate? Not asking for the 50 or the 100 acres or the 500 acres you gave to colonial settlers and homesteaders. I'm talking about just 40 acres and a mule might do. And so these men who met in New Bern in August 1865 issued a call to other black men to join them in Raleigh, North Carolina in September. Their selection of September 29, 1865 was not some arbitrary date, for they knew that President Andrew Johnson had instructed all governors of seceded states to hold a state convention to, first of all, eliminate or confirm the state's abolishment of slavery and even acknowledge that seceding from the United States in 1861 was an illegal act. William W. Holden had been appointed by President Johnson to serve as provisional governor of North Carolina. This meeting of black men on September 29, 1865 was known as the Freedmen's Convention. They consciously wanted to upstage the state convention. They wanted state convention attendees and Governor Holden to know what they wanted as newly freed people. The Freedmen's Convention convened on September 29, 1865, at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Raleigh, 3 days before Holden's state convention began. With more than 100 delegates in attendance from counties primarily in eastern and Piedmont, North Carolina, the convention began. James Walker Hood from New Bern was elected president of the convention. Hood, a bishop in the AME Church, had been active in the fight for black civil and human rights in the North. He said to his fellow delegates, quote, "We and the white people have to live here together. Some people talk of immigration for the black race, some of expatriation, and some of colonization. I regard this as all nonsense. We have been living together for 100 years and more, and we have got to live together still. And the best way is to harmonize our feelings as much as possible and to treat all men respectfully," unquote. Abraham Galloway, James Harris, a local black citizen, and other delegates made speeches during the 4-day convention. All speeches were related to attaining first-class citizenship. As with any assemblage of human beings, there were different views and expressions of different avenues to take to secure agreed upon objectives. Some delegates believed that blacks should not fight to secure the ballot. Others believed that they needed to be careful and not ask for the right to serve on juries when a white person was charged with a crime, while others believed that the convention should be, in effect, nice, kind, and gentle when approaching whites for their rights. These differences of opinion and approach undoubtedly led to healthy debate over several days. The delegates understood that their efforts could not end with a one-time convention. So while in session, they decided to establish an organization through which they could advance the goals of the convention and their future goals. That organization was the North Carolina State Equal Rights League. They would achieve their objectives by, quote, "political and moral means as far as may be the repeal of all laws and parts of laws, state and national, which make distinctions on account of color," unquote. Their immediate goals were access to the ballot box, the right to testify in court against whites, and to serve as jurors. The delegates left the meeting hopeful, but within a few months, their hopes and dreams were deferred because by the end of March 1866, the North Carolina legislature had passed a series of laws known as Black Codes. North Carolina followed the course of Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, and the other southern states when they instituted laws that were similar to the slave codes. 9 laws were proposed, including a ban on interracial marriages, vagrancy to restrict the movement of the formerly enslaved, a ban on carrying weapons without a license, rape of a white woman by a black man was punishable by death. For a white man, the sentence was 2 years and a public whipping. There were limits on blacks testifying against whites in court and apprentice laws. In April 1866, the Civil Rights Bill was passed over President Johnson's veto, who believed that too many rights for black people would lead to what he called an Africanization of the South. The Civil Rights Bill did 2 important things. 1, made the formerly enslaved citizens of the United States and the states in which they were born Secondly, the Civil Rights Bill served of 1866 overturned the black codes. However, that was short-lived because as Southern states were redeemed, they again instituted laws that were akin to the slave and black codes. And many of these laws were in place until the 1960s. With such a white backlash to the 13th Amendment that had been ratified in December 1865, and President Johnson's continued support of the former Confederates because he believed that blacks were innately and inherently inferior to whites, and that essentially, he said, the lowest white man in the social hierarchy should be above the highest black man, unquote. The leaders of the Freedmen's Convention in 1865, who were now leaders of the Equal Rights League, decided on another convention and set the date for October 2nd through the 5th, 1866. 115 delegates representing 60 counties in North Carolina assembled at the St. Paul AME Church in Raleigh, and we are fortunate that we have so many of those minutes from the proceedings. After electing officers, appointing committees, committee chairs, sergeant-at-arms, and taking care of other convention business, the first session began on the morning of October 2nd. Delegates invited several white leaders, including Governor Holden, Thomas Bragg, who was a former governor, U.S. Senator, and who eventually was part of the team that successfully prosecuted Governor Holden, leading to his impeachment and conviction in 1870. William A. Graham was invited, a former governor, U.S. Senator, a North Carolina House member who represented Orange County between 1833 and 1840, and a member of the prosecuting team that convicted Governor Holden. And the convention invited Bartholomew F. Moore, an attorney who served as state attorney general and state representative. Most of the individuals turned down those invitations to speak to the delegates, but Governor Holden did speak. In summary, Governor Holden said this. He said, quote, "The general good feeling between the two races in this state should be cultivated and strengthened. This was the home of the black man as well as the white man. The two races should mutually sustain each other. The black man needed the knowledge the white man had of the arts and sciences and of history and government. He was also dependent on the white man for lands and houses. The white race needed the black as aids in cultivating and improving the country. They may also be needed to defend the country against foreign foes. They would be the main reliance in some portions of the state in producing the great staples. The first care of the black people should be to procure homes, no matter how cheap or small. To do this, they must be industrious, temperate, and economical. Labor was the first great consideration. They had no time to waste at public gatherings. They should not congregate in the towns in greater numbers than might be necessary for business. And they should avoid all temptations to idleness and dissipation. The first thing was to get homes, and the next was, while they still labor, to improve and add to their possessions. To educate their children, education was good for all races and colors. Knowledge, he said, was power," end of quote. As a general rule, people were virtuous and useful in proportion as they were educated. It was evident by October 1866 that the delegates continued to push for civil and human rights through legislation and the courts, but what seemed to have dominated the deliberations were discussions about the safety and the security of black North Carolinians. The Freedmen's Bureau, as well as citizens across the state, have begun to report the atrocities being committed by whites against blacks throughout the state. Nearly 30 lynchings of black men had occurred by the start of the convention in October 1866. The following resolution attests to the urgency of the moment. Be it resolved that the colored people in every county, district, and village throughout the state form themselves into auxiliary leagues, which leagues must be connected with the state organization, its bureau to be located in Raleigh, North Carolina, and whose duty it shall be to receive reports of outrages from auxiliary leagues or from the people of said counties, and communicate them to headquarters and such newspapers throughout the county as it may deem proper, so that the government and the world may know of the cruelties inflicted upon us and the disadvantages under which we labor, that we earnestly protest against such violations and will do all in our power to prevent its further continuation. The delegates drew up a resolution which endorsed the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. A portion of the resolution called on the United States Congress to enact legislation to protect equally the rights of all American people without regard to race or color. And the delegates maintained that those of you who live in the former Confederate states regard taxation without representation as unjust. We do too. And such is directly in violation of our sacred rights as American citizens. Under the Black Codes, apprenticeship laws were established allowing whites to take the children of former enslaved people and in effect use them as slaves. The delegates drew up the following resolution to bring attention to this problem. They said, whereas in and through the counties of the state, our children, the dearest ties of which binds us to domestic life and which makes the ties of home enduring, are ruthlessly taken from us and bound out without our consent. Therefore, be it resolved that it shall be the duty of every member of the Convention on Returning Home to form or cause to be formed an Equal Rights League in or near the place wherein each member shall reside, and do all in his power to promote their increase throughout other portions of his county. In a resolution, delegates encouraged black people to respect and patronize each other in their various branches of business. And they saluted Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, a leading champion of black rights. They saluted Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from Pennsylvania and staunch supporter of blacks, and especially the fact that Stevens wanted to distribute land to the former slaves. Stevens was one of the chief architects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments before he died in 1868. And he led the charge to impeach Andrew Johnson. They also offered their thanks to Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett, who were beacon lights of the black race, they said. The delegates to the Freedmen's Convention in October 1866 also believed that education was one of the keys to black success. And so they established the Freedmen's Educational Association of North Carolina to aid in the establishment of schools for freedmen and others, regardless of color or economic standing. I think that most observers of the four-day convention would agree that the delegates who assembled in Raleigh for the convention were on the meek, mild, and really kind of non-demanding side to a great extent. The following resolution to the black and white citizens of North Carolina, I think is a testimony to this. Fellow citizens, they say, can we look to you for protection or not, to shield us from the murderous hand? O humanity, where is thy blush? Our defenseless wives and children, fathers, sons, and brothers are beaten with clubs, robbed, shot, and killed in various localities, and the authorities regard it as nothing. We beg you as white men in authority to shield our defenseless heads and guard our little homes. We appeal to your religion and your humanity. We claim by merit the right of suffrage and ask it at your hands. We believe the day has come when black men have rights which white men are bound to respect. We intend to live and die on this soil which gave us birth. O North Carolina, the land of our birth. With all thy faults, we love thee still. Will you treat us as human beings with all our rights, with all our rights? It is all that we ask. We are your humble servants in behalf of the state's Equal Rights League. Many of the Equal Rights League leaders went on to become politicians at the state, local, and national levels, fighting for the rights articulated in the Freedmen's Conventions. Coming off the heels of the 1866 convention, 13 black Republicans, some of them who were at the convention in 1865 and 1866, representing 19 counties, were elected to help write the new state constitution in 1868. So how do we assess the Freedmen's Conventions and the Equal Rights League of the 1860s and their impact on the struggle for black civil and human rights? These organizations placed the agenda of black folks on the table: access to the ballot, the right to serve on juries and to testify against whites who fought a daily fight to return the formerly enslaved to a state of slavery, using any means at their disposal. They fought for an end to apprenticeship laws. They pushed for an allocation of abandoned lands for the formerly enslaved. That is the 40 acres and a mule concept. They cried out to authorities to do something about the daily atrocities heaped upon black folks. The conventions launched the careers of several men who continued the struggle and resistance to oppression in the 20th century. John Hyman and James O'Hara served in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. during the Reconstruction period and beyond. And between 1868 and 1900, more than 100 blacks served in the North Carolina General Assembly. The agenda set by the Freedmen's Convention and the work of these formerly enslaved and free black men to secure greater measures of freedom unfortunately remain in many ways on the table today. Thank you.
And next, we're going to hear from Dr. Tyson. Give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you, Corey, and I especially want to thank the indefatigable and undefeatable James Williams. When James asks me to do something, I don't let him even finish his sentence before I say yes, because I know I've got no chance. W.E.B. Du Bois paints the moment of emancipation for the 4 million newly freed persons in the South. God had made them free. All that was beauty, all that was love, all that was truth stood on top of these mad mornings and sang with the stars. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. Nothing can undermine the power of that moment. Yet there's another truth at work, which is that emancipation, as we've seen today, happened in many different places and in many different ways and at many different times. And above all, I would say, it remains an ongoing project, incomplete to this day, one dependent on educating ourselves. Ella Baker said, in order to see where we are going, we must not only remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. Our Abolition Day is just one part of that effort. And emancipation has always been driven by the same humane, democratic, and self-assertive black vision that toppled slavery, and by an unquenchable thirst for education. The struggle for education has been part of the struggle for freedom and full access to the bounties of American life. There's never been a moment when a more democratic public education for all did not have to be defended from the forces of white supremacy and economic domination. Today, we see an explicit authoritarian attack on stories of the black freedom struggle, but on history itself. The black battle for education can never be defined by its opposition from the defenders of white supremacy. But the opposition does offer useful diagnostic. The North Carolina Slave Code banned reading and writing or to act in any way as a preacher or teacher under penalty not to exceed 39 lashes on his bare back. In 1855, the legislature extended this ban to include free black persons. After the fall of slavery, white elites opposed public education for anyone, their reasoning being that if you want education for your children, it's your duty to provide it, and the state has no business in that, and they were not going to pay one dime for it for anyone, but especially for black folk. After the fall of slavery, the newly freed black Southerners did not cooperate with this vision whatsoever. Booker T. Washington wrote of black Southerners after the Civil War, "It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn." Self-help and self-determination marked this crusade. The superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau found at least 500 schools across the South independently organized by the formerly enslaved, who did not wait for the Freedmen's Bureau or for white philanthropy, though those things eventually helped. Du Bois writes, "Public education for all at public expense was in the South a Negro idea." In 1866 in North Carolina, the former Confederates took power and complained bitterly that public education was a wildly radical notion, which is a good point. And they immediately banned public schools. In Raleigh, however, a white woman named Gertrude Trappier defied the law and opened a school on Salisbury Street, opened it for all. Black women and their allies continued to open these illegal schools, and by 1868 had enrolled 700 of Wake County's 900 black children. In 1868, after Congress took power over Reconstruction, black and white citizens organized an interracial alliance that wrote a new state constitution, making access to a sound and equal education a constitutional right, and banned the use of public education funds for any other purpose. Though conservatives tried to mandate segregation, Bishop J.W. Hood of the AME Zion Church prevailed, arguing, "Make this distinction of race in your organic law, and in many places the white children will have good schools at the expense of the whole people, while the colored children will have none, or what will be little better than none. In 1868, the interracial Reconstruction government chose Reverend Samuel Ashley, a white Congregationalist minister, and Bishop J.W. Hood to direct public education. They created the first system of free tax-supported schools in the South. Reconstruction ended by Southern violence and white indifference, Northern indifference, rather. White terror targeted black schools, black churches that served as schools, and black educators in particular. White conservatives did not want to pay a dime of taxes to support anyone's education, but especially African Americans. Black citizens, however, continued to educate their children by any means necessary. The violent toppling of Reconstruction did not diminish black educational aspirations. In the 1890s, black and white farmers, beset by agricultural depression and conservative devotion to economic and racial hierarchies, began to see each other as potential political allies. Public education was perhaps the strongest issue that united the new fusion movement. In 1896 and 1894, the interracial fusion movement swept the state legislature, elected a fusionist governor, and could not be beaten at the polls, lost not one statewide election. The accomplishments of the fusion government featured greatly increased funding for public education. White elites insisted that education would encourage black resistance to white supremacy, which was also a good point. In 1898 and 1900, white elites organized the white supremacy campaigns, which overthrew the fusionist state government by fraud and by force, including the Wilmington Massacre and coup. In 1900, the new white supremacy regime imposed literacy tests for voters designed to be racially administered to block back black ballots. This included the grandfather clause, which exempted from the literacy test anyone whose grandfather had been eligible to vote. The subsequent creation of a one-party racial state under the new Jim Crow laws preserved white dominion until the Civil Rights era. Any education funded for black citizens was designed to strengthen white domination, though black educators persistently undermined these goals. The Jim Crow era continued the patient building of black educational institutions and traditions. This was preparation for the struggle for something better than the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal ruling would permit. As Bishop Hood had predicted, the insertion of race into the organic law meant that black schools would never be treated equally, that separate but equal remained strictly a legal fiction. Under Governor Aycock, the first so-called education governor of many self-proclaimed, the state allocated 3 times more for each white child than for each black child. Even under deprivation and indignity, black citizens built strong educational traditions with a devoted teacher corps intent on preparing students for the struggles ahead. Excuse me. North Carolina NAACP in the 1940s and 1950s simultaneously sued for equalization of school funding for black schools using the Plessy ruling and an end to segregation. African Americans generally supported both equalization of black schools and racial integration. The indignities and inequalities heaped on black schools fueled both struggles. With the NAACP's victory in Brown versus Board of Education, white conservatives in North Carolina passed the 1956 Pearsall Plan. This plan guaranteed that parents whose children might be compelled to attend integrated schools would be eligible for state funding to send their children to private segregated schools. Using public money for private education, though it expressly violated the state constitution, would remain a constant goal for white conservatives, as it is today. And black citizens would continue to fight for strong, well-funded public schools as essential to the cause of freedom. Though this history continues, this talk cannot. But I hope we can further explore these matters. Thank you.
And now we will hear some wise words from Professor Gerhardt. Give him a round of applause, please.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I appreciate the hope that you just expressed that Professor Gerhardt would actually have any wise words to share with us. But let me say also how grateful I am to be here. As I made the half-mile walk today from my car to be here, I thought to myself, wow, as I walked through the parades, that James is more powerful than I thought. He actually arranged for a parade on Abolition Day. I have to confess, I've always thought of Abolition Day as more of a promise than a fact. It's a promise that we have to struggle to keep alive. I also have thought, as I look out at the audience, weirdly enough, about the movie This Is Spinal Tap. Because at one point, the leader of Spinal Tap is asked about the fact that they don't sell out anymore. And he responds, well, our audiences have just become more selective. So I want to thank all of you for being more selective and remaining. But I want to talk about that promise just for a moment. That unfulfilled promise. I don't think it is at all a coincidence that today in America, there are people wearing masks, tyrannizing people of color. That is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that we have a president of the United States who calls people garbage just as soon as yesterday. It is not a coincidence that in the United States today, we find ourselves yet again with a president who wants to whitewash American history, something he does each and every day. I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s in the Deep South. And I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s as a Jew in Mobile, Alabama. I was not at the center of the civil rights movement. As I often say to people, I could see it from where I stood and where I stand today. And I'm grateful for it, but I never take anything for granted in the United States of America, and nor should anybody here. I wish the promise of Abolition Day had been realized, but I don't believe it ever has been. I believe it is still a promise we have to struggle again to try to realize every single day. Several years ago, I had the privilege of being part of a dialogue with the historian David Blight at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, where I am the resident scholar. And our program was about what did America look like the day after the 13th Amendment was ratified. It didn't look much different than it did the day before. And I think that is very telling. I also think it is very telling that in spite of all the great successes that Abraham Lincoln had, that at the end he was killed. I think the greatest quality Abraham Lincoln had was to be educable. He did not begin as the man he became. He began pretty much as any white person probably did in those days, unfamiliar with what was going to happen and what he had to confront. And I think if there's anything to be learned from his presidency, it is the fact that he was educable. He was a man who used all that racist language, believed the solution that America ought to somehow embrace was not the emancipation of African Americans, but instead he believed that they should return to their homeland, something he thought pretty much until the day he became president of the United States. It is not a coincidence that he was that he prided himself as a student of Henry Clay, who was the president of the American Colonization Society, whose vice president was Andrew Jackson. And that too ought to sound very much familiar to all of us today, because as we look out across America, I think what we see is not the promise of Abolition Day, but instead the concerted effort to bury it. And it is our job, as best we can, to revive it and to try to keep its promise alive. In doing that, I just want to say a few other things. To begin with, I think one of the most important things any of us can hope for is what Professor Tyson just talked about, and that is education. I have thanked Professor Joyner for giving my speech earlier today. I will not reiterate it at all, but I do want to take a page from what he said and recognize that in the struggle of civil rights have never been fully realized. Not for a day, not at all. And if there's nothing that could remind us of that fact more, all we have to do is look to Washington as, I think, a failure, not a success. And our job is to overcome that failure today and every day. That's the promise I made when I grew up. That's the promise I hope to keep when I grew up. That is the promise I hope to fulfill someday, but not today. In America, we are not at a crossroads, but we live in a country where half of that country does not want to move forward. Half of that country wants to return to the day before the 13th Amendment was ratified. We have a president and a Congress that want to return to the day before the 13th Amendment was ratified. We have, again, half the country that refuses to be educated, that refuses to recognize its own history and to embrace that history, as awful and as promising as it has been. It has never been great. It has always been sad. It has never been happy. It has always been a step away from the realization of the promise of Reconstruction, which was never, ever realized. Reconstruction is still an experiment. It's still something we have to work every day to try and even achieve. Once we had Reconstruction, it ended pretty much the day it started. When I joined Professor Blight in that conversation about the day after the 13th Amendment, realizing, again, that the world looked pretty much the same as it did the day before the 13th Amendment was ratified. But one thing we actually do have is the history that we have traveled to reach the point at which we arrive today to realize that the work of civil rights is never done. It is a promise. It is a challenge. It is not a fact. My hope has always been, since I grew up in Alabama, in the Deep South, to be able to go to a place in America where I thought the promise of America could be realized. When I left Alabama, I traveled up north because I hoped to get an education. And when I arrived at Yale, I arrived at a place where my roommate was anti-Semitic. And that was a reminder that you can go far, but you can't leave the past behind. The past is going to hit you in the face, just like it hit me when I unpacked my bags in New Haven, Connecticut. Because I realized, I knew, it didn't take me long to understand that I had come to a place that I had never left. I never left Mobile, Alabama, because it's America. It is the America we live in, a place which refuses to fully accept its own past, a place that elects a president who wants more than anything else to return to the worst part of our history. And our challenge again is to try and make that history live, to try and make that history a reality, to try to make that history something we can all recognize and embrace. It is not something everybody does today at all. Not everyone in America wants the promise of America to be realized. They want it to be buried. They want it to be undone. They want to return to a time when civil rights was just a hope, not a reality. And the greatest challenge of my career has been to confront the fact that when I left Alabama, I never left Alabama. My wife is from Cleveland, and when she first traveled with me to go back to my home 20 years after we were married, the first thing she said was how it felt that she had arrived at a place 50 years ago. It felt to her that we were living in a place that was 50 years ago. And when I came back to Alabama not too long ago, it felt more like the place I grew up in than the place that any of us had hoped would get better. There is a place, as I think everybody in this room knows, in Mobile, Alabama, called Africa's Town. When I grew up, nobody even heard of it. When I visited, my father took me there, and it looked like a bomb had landed. It doesn't look that way today, but that bomb is just this far away from being dropped yet again on us. And I will end today with what I hope is a promise we can all work to try to achieve, which is the dream that has never been realized in America, that Reconstruction is still in front of us, not behind us. It is a promise yet to be delivered. And I will hope before I die that that promise will be realized.
We're going to keep it going with Dr. Watts Smith. Give her a round of applause, please.
I'm going to do a little jazz here so that I will be done by 2 o'clock. I want to echo my colleagues here, the fellow panelists, to thank OCCRC, the leaders, and the program committee. I appreciate the invitation. Given Judge Wynn's comments, his writing that Abolition Day is a day for accountability and for grappling with a history that still reverberates in the lives of millions, I thought that I would spend a little bit of time to illuminate the ways in which technologies of evasion and the 15th Amendment have been updated over the past 155 years, because it's like a later amendment. We might ask, I mean, the 15th Amendment, we all value the right to vote. The right to vote preserves all other rights. And, you know, we see that our right to vote is often manipulated, and we might ask, how is it so that this particular right, that is our most fundamental right, can be so easily shifted and moved around? The U.S. Constitution does not explicitly outline a right to vote. Instead, what the Constitution does is kind of relies on a process of elimination. So over time, it has constrained the number of reasons and ways that the 50 states can call on to abridge the right to vote. So the 15th Amendment, which as Dr. Parker noted earlier, was up for debate. It was not inevitable. It was not necessarily definitely going to happen, but it did. But it does not explicitly provide Black men the right to vote as is commonly understood. The spirit of that amendment was there, but the letter of the law instead says that that states cannot turn someone away from the ballot due to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And a similar logic is relied upon for the 19th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment. And so this distinction between allowing someone to vote and finding a reason to not allow them to vote is really important, because what it does is provide a lot of space for reasons why someone still cannot vote. And so I just offer this up just to make sure our antennae are up around what exactly is going on around here. This kind of, this wiggle room, I guess, is maybe a charitable way to say it, that the Constitution provides, means that we can use a slew of reasons, often that are race neutral and seem perfectly normal and even laudable, like for voter integrity, can be used to reduce the access to the ballot. So in the past, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and literacy tests essentially relied upon family heritage, access to jobs, and access to education, right? Those are not the things that are listed in the Constitution. And we see similar patterns today. So for example, we have residential segregation. Recently, a group out of Berkeley noted that the overwhelming majority of metropolitan areas are more racially segregated now than they were in 1990. And so tactics such as the elimination and consolidation of voting precincts, strategic relocation of polling places, misallocation of resources to those polling places, can rely on residential segregation, which can be seen as a race-neutral reason, but have racialized effects. One example, I think, well, actually there was one from maybe last week when the Guilford Board of Elections voted on partisan lines to remove early voting stations from UNCG and A&T. Now that's young people, and that's young people of color, and the folks who work there. Or Alabama, during budget crises, said that they would, this is about a decade ago, close 31 DMVs. And studies show that 8 out of 10 of Alabama counties with the highest percentage of non-white registered voters saw their DMVs closed. And political scientists like myself show that once you ask someone to register, they usually say yes, and once you get them registered, they often will vote. So we can see how residential segregation turned to removal of a DMV, which removes the chances of someone registering to vote and then voting. And so, like, sometimes it sounds conspiratorial, but they're very well connected. I mean, we can make similar kind of patterns with transportation, or the kinds of jobs that people have. If you live in a particular area where public transportation is difficult, we can go down that line. Or we know that Black folks tend to be, are more likely to be in hourly or contingent workers who work in places that have less autonomy, irregular work hours, or don't provide childcare. So we can move on down the line about how that makes it more difficult to vote. We can talk about even disability. And so we know that, due to racial disparities in healthcare, that structural inequalities around healthcare and disability also influence access to the ballot. So, best known during COVID, right? The removal of, curbside voting, or even having accessible voting stations. We can go on down the line. So I mostly am just trying to show how these kind of seemingly disparate inequalities can be put in conversation and overlapped in ways that seem, like plausible deniability about racial inequality in voting, but do have real racialized effects. I want to close. I often, I don't know why people invite me to stuff, because I never have good news, but I do want to say that we don't have to live like this, and that there are plenty of people and policy proposals that have been put on the table. So, there's the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. And, even in 2014, there was a presidential commission on election administration that focused specifically on disability access, ranging from, online voting and increasing voter registration, and having flexible voting opportunities and not being turned away from your precinct if you're at the wrong one, or having less restrictive absentee ballots, or mobile voting for certain facilities, like let's say at nursing homes, as an example. We know that there are already states that, people might talk about felon disenfranchisement as another kind of racialized policy that's like extended through from Jim Crow. There are states that allow people in prison to vote. California recently changed their policy to allow people who are in jail who have not been convicted of a crime to vote. A lot of these kinds of things, if we talk about them, people will give us buts or whys or are you sure or what ifs. And so it's not just, I think, sometimes a political obstacle around this issue, but also a lack of imagination. But I think that a zoom out, we can see that there are other ways of being, and that the way that we do the things that we do them now are by no means inevitable. Thank you.
All right, so I have one question for the panelists, and hopefully you can satisfy a little bit of my curiosity. I was drawn by the young woman's question from the last panel about bringing in these companies, holding them accountable. And so my question is inspired from that. And it's also inspired from Candace's book, Stay Woke. So we saw a lot of the promise with Black Lives Matter and people waking up and demanding change. How do we continue to stay woke in an environment that is increasingly hostile, violently divisive, and dangerous? Offer us some advice to continue to hold some of these people and structures and systems accountable, and give us sort of our marching orders as we prepare to walk out of this building.
Since I started first, I'll start first. I think Brother Tyson had it right. Education is important. But, you know, first of all, I think you have to realize that indeed the problem exists, and you have to impart that to people. Folks think that things are going along smoothly and things are wonderful, but if they don't, if they're not taught that things are bad, so to speak, then they will think that things are okay. So the education is the first thing. I think forums like we have here today are part of that. I know folks will say, y'all just talking, what about some action? Well, hopefully what you hear today will cause you to go out and act. I have a program that I call Information Plus Hour that we deal with issues and problems, and hopefully people will leave that Zoom discussion and deal with some of the issues they face. So I think first of all it's education and definitely letting people know that indeed the problem exists.
Well, one thing I want to say is, you know, there is a great hope. We do have a movement building in this country. And we all need to work in our own issues, in our own ways, but we also need to come together in a movement big enough and strong enough to topple the existing arrangements. It won't do to just limit yourself to the thing that you're most concerned about without an eye to the larger movement that has to happen, because it's fundamentally a question of power. There are enough people who see the wrong and the stupidity of what is going on to change things, but we have to organize. And that's being done, so the thing to do is find the people who are doing it and go help them, which is Ella Baker's wisdom, not mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think one of the lessons of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which happened not too long ago, is that too many people took that for granted. And I think that one of the things that's become extremely important is not to take any advancement for granted. if you do advance, I think you have to protect it. I think you have to recognize that it's not going to just simply be cemented into our system of law or into our society. It only works if people continue to carry on the movement, as Professor Tyson, I think, was just saying. So I think part of the purpose of education, and that is why we're here today, in part to be educated, is to understand that the work is never done. The work has to continue. We have to be committed to it. We have to understand that the only way to push back against an entire government, I think, that is devoted to try and take us back as far as we can go in terms of history. And I think the only way to overcome that is to be, like Lincoln and others, to be educable, to understand that what we're seeing now doesn't have to be the case. What the other side wants, and there's always been another side, don't forget that. I mean, there's always been. From the day the 13th Amendment came into effect, there's always been an effort to undermine the advancement of civil rights. That's been the story of America. And I think the only way to make that story better is to keep trying to make it better.
Michael, you mentioned that there was, well, I mean, you were having a conversation with Professor Blight about the day before and the day after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, that there wasn't a lot of difference. But, oh, yeah, can you hear me now better? I think one of the differences between the day before and the day after the ratification of the 13th Amendment is that something happened that many people thought were impossible. And so I think that what I would say to your question is that it's important for us to keep our imaginations really broad and our capacity for believing that the impossible can become possible is really important to orient ourselves towards a North Star, even if it appears very far away.
That's poignant. Thank you. I want to thank you guys. I want to thank the scholars, both here on the stage and the ones who came before, for this very, very powerful and necessary conversation. It's not going to be the last. The struggle continues on. As Professor Gerhardt said, there is always going to be an other side, and so we always must be prepared to fight back. The 13th Amendment, as we know today, now, it did not end the story of abolition. It began a new chapter that's filled with struggle, courage, and ongoing demands for justice. In our work today, whether it occurs here in rooms like these, in classrooms, in archives, in courtrooms, in community spaces, we have to continue pushing forward for full freedom. It's not here yet, and we are not going to wait around and wait for somebody to show us that they're human, their humanity. We're not going to wait for their charity. It was promised, it was never fully delivered, and now is the time to demand it. And I want to thank you for helping us demand that full freedom. Thank you. And thank James, he's pushy. All right. James is coming up. He has words for you.
Oh, sorry.
So, again, thanks to Corey and the panel for an excellent job. And I want to thank you because, you know, we invited you here, we asked you to stay. we didn't provide food or drink and you still stayed. I know my mother would said, James, you don't do that, you don't. But I appreciate the fact that you did stay. And I want you I'm glad you stayed for another reason. There's a part of the program that's not on the program that's kind of like a surprise, kind of my surprise. And so we're going to go there before we adjourn. And I do think part of what was being discussed, Candace, and this thing of hope, it is so crucial even when things are bleak. Jesse Jackson, who forgets Jesse, Keep Hope Alive, and Dr. King, and Brian Stevenson all talk about the importance of hope when we try to address these very serious problems. And so with that said as a preface, you've heard Freddie Parker, the scholar. You've seen Freddie Parker, the photographer out there. And now I'm going to present you Freddie Parker, the artist. It is your time, Dr. Parker.
Thank you, James. Let me see if I can draw this picture for you. We talk about where we are, but, man said a long time ago in 1964, the change gonna come. You can always hope for that. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the skies. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown, and somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. And then I go to my brother, and I say, brother, help me please, my. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Well, there've been times when I thought couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time
time coming, but I know, everybody say, a change gonna come. Whoa, yes it will.